Welcome to the Remedify Coaching Program podcast. We always love to take deep dives into all sorts of things, but today we're diving into something a little different.
Yeah, you could say that.
A presentation, actually, called Critical Thinking Skills That Disarm Evolutionists.
Interesting title.
Yeah, it is. And it's by Mike Ruddle from creationtraining.org.
Okay.
And this one actually came straight from one of our listeners, so thank you for sending that in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we want to really break down what are the main arguments here, what are these critical thinking skills, especially for analyzing evolution.
Right. And, it is a bit of a different perspective when we're looking at origins and how life came to be and diversity of life. So, yeah, it should be an interesting deep dive.
Yeah, and I think what really stood out to me initially is it really focuses on how do we even evaluate these claims about evolution? Instead of jumping right into the science, it's like, how do we think about this? What are even some of the approaches that people use, right? Like sometimes it's like discrediting other views or maybe focusing on authority, like who said it, or the fact that a textbook says it.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting the presentation kind of hits on those, different arguments that come up in this whole conversation. They talk about discrediting the Bible or creation and using intimidation or appeals to authority.
Right.
So it's definitely going to be an interesting discussion.
Yeah. And I think even throwing out these big millions of years without really explaining, okay, what's the evidence for those millions of years?
Yeah.
So it kind of pushes back on that. And I think what's really at the heart of this whole presentation is this critical thinking method. It talks about instead of countering right away with different scientific data, it's let's just look at the statements themselves and ask some key questions about them.
Right. So instead of bringing, your own presuppositions or biases to it, let's really analyze what's being said and see if it holds up.
Yeah, exactly. So they have these, what they call critical thinking questions, and that's kind of their method. So what are the 3 critical thinking questions that they want us to use?
So the first one is, how do you know that it's true?
Okay.
The second one is, has it ever been observed? And the third one is, are you making any assumptions?
I like it. So they're really getting down to okay, what's the basis of this claim?
Yeah, and I think what they're trying to do is equip people with a way to analyze any statement that comes out, regarding evolution and just apply those questions, kind of hold people accountable to what they're saying.
Right. So it's not about coming in with your own kind of different scientific view. It's just okay, let's dissect what you're actually saying.
Exactly.
Yeah. So they have these examples. And the first one is, life originated in a pool of chemicals about 3.7 billion years ago.
Okay.
And I think it looks like they pulled this from a Miller and Levine biology textbook. And the quote they have is, scientists do know that about 200 to 300 million years after Earth cooled enough to carry liquid water, cells similar to modern bacteria were common. So we're talking early life here.
Right. So I think, one of the things is we do find these fossils or these evidences of life early on.
Yeah.
So I think the textbook is saying, hey, we know that about 200 to 300 million years after Earth cooled down enough that it could carry liquid water, right? So liquid water is essential for life.
Right.
Cells similar to modern bacteria were common. So we know bacteria were already around.
Yeah, and so they're comparing that to, okay, well, this statement is going way back further to the origin of life. So how do those 3 critical thinking questions, how would you use them to analyze this statement?
So the first one, how do you know that it's true? I would be curious, to look into, okay, what is the evidence that shows us that life originated in a pool of chemicals?
Right, where's the evidence?
Exactly, yeah. Where's that smoking gun, right?
And have we ever observed that?
Yeah.
Have we ever actually seen life come from non-life?
Right. Or, have we been able to replicate that in a lab?
Right.
Because that would be, pretty big news.
Right. And then what are the assumptions, right, behind that statement?
Yeah. So what are we assuming about those early conditions? What are we assuming about the chemicals and their ability to form life? Are those assumptions, really based on solid evidence, or are they more speculative?
Yeah, I like it. Okay, so that's the first example and kind of how they apply those 3 questions. Now, they also talk about this power question. What's the power question?
So the power question that they bring up is, show me any observational evidence for evolution that does not require me to use faith. So that's kind of the main point of the whole presentation.
Yeah, so it's really pushing on, okay, where's the evidence that we can actually see?
Exactly. Yeah.
Not just kind of well, I believe this happened.
Right. Yeah. Faith and observation, 2 different things. Right.
Right. And so they use the power question in another example here.
Mm-hmm.
And the statement is, life must be on other planets. It's arrogant to believe we are the only life in the universe.
Yeah, so it's interesting, this whole topic of extraterrestrial life has really captured the imagination.
Right, and everyone's looking for it.
Exactly. And I think, the presentation is just challenging that assumption that, just because the universe is so vast that life must exist somewhere else.
All right. So how would you apply the power question here?
Well, it's basically saying, show me any observational evidence, right? Like,
Oh,
is
yeah.
there any actual, concrete evidence that we can point to that proves that life exists elsewhere in the universe?
Right,
We
right.
can speculate all we want, but without that evidence, it remains, a possibility,
Yeah,
but not a
sure.
certainty. Right.
So again, focusing on what's observable.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, and the last example they use is, over millions of years, mutations added new genetic information, allowing for all the diversity of life we see today. So this one's talking about mutations and their ability to kind of create all this complexity.
Right. And I think it's interesting because that is, one of the main tenets of evolutionary theory, right?
Right.
That over time, these small changes, these mutations, can accumulate
Yeah.
and lead to, new features, new species.
Yeah. And so what power question would you use to address this?
So here you could ask, show me any observational evidence for where the vast amount of information in our DNA came from that does not require me to use faith.
Okay.
So again, really challenging the assumption that mutations can account for the complexity and the diversity of life that we see around us.
Right. Like, where did that information come from?
Right, exactly.
Okay, cool. So I think a big theme here is differentiating between what we can actually observe and test and what we kind of believe about the past.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction, right? What we can do in the present and what we're trying to, reconstruct from the past.
Yeah. So now they get into some interesting language stuff.
Okay.
They talk about these fuzzy words.
Fuzzy words, okay.
What are fuzzy words?
So fuzzy words are basically words that lack precision. They can kind of, introduce uncertainty or doubt into a statement. So, like, they're not really, black and white. They're kind of, fuzzy.
Okay.
So examples of fuzzy words are words like believe, think, must have, could have, might have, our opinion is, we guess, and, the infamous over millions of years.
Yeah. So it's like instead of saying this happened, it's like, well, we think this could have happened.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, the presentation highlights those words because they often signal a lack of, direct observational support. It's like, instead of saying, we know this happened, they're saying, well, we think this could have happened.
Yeah, I see that.
So it's really important to pay attention to those fuzzy words.
And they have this example from a 7th grade life science textbook. And it says that paleontologists think that Archaeopteryx and today's birds descended from some kind of reptile, possibly from a dinosaur. So they're highlighting those fuzzy words.
Right. So think possibly. Those are all words that introduce a degree of uncertainty.
Yeah, it's not very definitive.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so they also talk about magic words. What are these magic words?
Well, they're called magic words because they seem to kind of magically describe these big...
How? Yeah.
Right. We want to know the step-by-step process.
And they have an example. They say, around 230 million years ago during the Triassic period, a new type of reptile emerged on the scene. Dinosaurs would rule the land for 160 million years. And they're highlighting emerged as that magic word.
Right. So it's like, okay, a new type of reptile emerged, but what were the specific evolutionary steps that led to this new type of reptile? What were the genetic changes? What were the environmental pressures? The presentation is just encouraging us to, dig a little deeper and not just accept these magic words at face value.
Yeah. And it looks like the last language thing they talk about are these red flag words.
Red flags.
What are those all about?
So red flag words are words that might indicate bias or a lack of, strong objective evidence. They're words that can be used to shut down debate or kind of, persuade people without really presenting solid evidence.
Okay.
So some examples of red flag words are absolutes, like all or everybody. Dismissive phrases like no real scientist or personal opinions presented as facts like I believe, I think, the truth.
Right.
And then terms that might be used to kind of label or categorize opposing viewpoints like fundamentalist or intolerant.
So these are words that try to kind of control the conversation.
Right. Yeah, they're not really focused on having an open and honest discussion about the evidence. They're more about, pushing a particular agenda.
I see that.
Okay.
Okay. And what about these red flag statements?
So they give some examples of red flag statements. Things like, people should decide for themselves what is right and wrong.
Okay.
No one has the whole truth.
Right.
All real scientists believe in evolution.
Okay.
Why are Christians so intolerant of other views? And I believe women should have the right to choose.
Okay.
So these are statements that can kind of derail the conversation, right?
Yeah. So it's, bringing in things that maybe aren't directly related.
Exactly. Yeah, they might introduce, personal beliefs or social or philosophical issues that aren't really relevant to the scientific discussion at hand.
Right. So I think the overall theme here is, be aware of how people are communicating, what language they're using.
Yeah, absolutely. Because language can be very powerful, right? It can be used to, shape our thinking and to persuade us of things. So it's really important to be critical of the language that's being used.
Cool. All right. So now they get into the fossil record, and they specifically talk about this statement. The fossil record proves evolution is true. And their critical thinking question here is, how much of the fossil was actually found and how much was added by artists?
Okay, so they're focusing on these reconstructions, these artist renditions of fossils.
Yeah, and so they give this example of Paxidesis.
Right.
Now, Paxidetus is often, used as this, early ancestor of whales.
Right. And it's often depicted as, this kind of aquatic creature.
Right.
But, what they're pointing out is that the initial fossil findings were mainly just skull fragments.
Right.
And so a lot of the reconstructions that we see are based on interpretations and assumptions. They're not necessarily based on, complete skeletons.
Right.
And later analyses actually suggested that Pakicetus was probably more of a land-dwelling mammal.
Oh, okay.
So it wasn't necessarily this, fully aquatic creature that it's often portrayed as.
Interesting. So the picture that we've been given may not be entirely accurate.
Right, exactly. And I think they're just encouraging us to be cautious about how we interpret fossil evidence.
Right.
Because, a lot of times those reconstructions can be very influential, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they also mentioned Piltdown Man as another example.
Oh, yeah.
That was kind of a hoax.
Yeah, it turned out to be a hoax where, they combine fragments from different species to create this, supposed missing link.
Right.
And it was, accepted for quite a while before it was eventually exposed as a fraud.
So it's a good reminder to always be critical of the evidence, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, to not just accept things at face value.
Yeah. Okay, so next though they talk about living fossils. What are living fossils and what's their argument about them?
So living fossils are basically organisms that we find in the fossil record that look very similar to their modern counterparts.
Okay.
So it's like they haven't really changed much over millions of years. And the presentation lists quite a few examples, things like turtles, spiders, starfish, bats, crabs, shrimp, dragonflies.
Wow.
Yeah. Horseshoe crabs, seahorses, frogs, alligators, coelacanth, tuatara lizard.
That's a long list.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Scorpions, jellyfish, they're all over the place.
Yeah, it's like all these different kinds of animals.
Exactly. Yeah, and the point they're making is, where's the evolution?
Yeah.
If these organisms have remained relatively unchanged for millions of years, doesn't that kind of challenge this idea of gradual, continuous evolution?
Yeah, if everything's always evolving, you'd think you'd see a lot more change in the fossil record.
Right, exactly. So it's definitely an interesting observation.
Yeah. Now, they also talk about the Cambrian explosion.
Yeah.
How do they describe that, and how do they see it as kind of a challenge to evolution?
So the Cambrian explosion refers to this period in Earth's history where we see a sudden appearance of all these complex life forms in the fossil record.
Okay.
It's like they just, burst onto the scene without any clear evolutionary ancestors.
And that's why they call it an explosion, right?
Exactly, yeah,
Okay.
because it was this very rapid diversification of life.
Yeah.
And they quote a number of sources who, highlight this challenge. They talk about how it's difficult to explain the sudden appearance of, fully formed species without those transitional forms that we would expect to see in the fossil record.
Right.
So they mentioned Jonathan Sarfati, John Ashton, R.K. Barnes, Peter Kahlo, P.W. Olive, all these people who are saying, hey, this is a real challenge to evolutionary theory.
Yeah, so it's like, where did they come from?
Right, exactly. It's one of those mysteries in the fossil record that raises some questions.
Okay. And lastly, they talk about fossil graveyards. What are those and why do they bring those up?
So fossil graveyards are basically large accumulations of fossils that are found together in these sedimentary layers.
Okay.
And it often suggests that they were buried very quickly, possibly due to some kind of catastrophic event.
Oh, wow.
And they give a bunch of examples like Agate Springs, Como Bluffs, the Cleveland Lloyd Quarry, fossil sites in Alaska, Siberia, Dinosaur National Monument, the nautiloid layer in the Grand Canyon.
So they're all over the place.
Yeah, they're all over the world.
Wow.
And they talk about, fossil graveyards in France, Wyoming, the Green River Formation,
Okay.
whale graveyards in Chile. So, there's this abundance of fossils that are found together in these mass burials.
And they're saying that maybe points towards something more catastrophic than just like normal, slow processes.
Right, exactly. Because you would think that, if these fossils were accumulating gradually over long periods of time, they would be more spread out.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But the fact that we find them in these concentrated areas, really does suggest that something dramatic happened.
Yeah, like a huge flood or something.
Right, exactly.
That's really interesting. So as we kind of wrap things up here, the presentation ends with two really important questions. Who will train the next generation? And what will they be trained to believe?
Yeah, I think those are really powerful questions, especially in today's world.
Right.
Because, who's teaching our kids?
Yeah.
And what are they being taught about origins?
Right.
About where we came from and what our purpose is.
Yeah. And so they kind of contrast these two worldviews, like a secular worldview and a biblical worldview.
Right. And they promote the Creation Training Initiative, which is, an organization that provides resources and training for educators who want to teach from a biblical perspective.
Okay, cool. Well, I think that was a really fascinating deep dive into these critical thinking methods presented in this critical thinking skills that disarm evolutionists. And it really encourages us to kind of stop and think and ask some questions about what we're being told.
Yeah,
Especially when it comes to, something as complex as evolution.
absolutely. I think it's so important to be able to think critically and to evaluate the evidence for ourselves.
Right. And if you want to learn more about these kinds of topics, we definitely encourage you to check out Tyrannus Hall Bible College, THBC.
Yeah, great resource.
Yeah, they have a YouTube channel at youtube.com. You met in Tyrannus Hall Bible College.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive on the Remedify Coaching Program podcast.
Yeah, it's been great.
Thank you for listening to the Remedify Coaching Program podcast.